It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I'm the expert of nothing. I'm just a bird nerd. And today we're talking specifically about a program that is designed to save endangered species. And I'm joined by Linda Bell, who's the manager of the program, the Saving Our Species program, with the Department of Environment. It's actually Department of Industry and Environment, isn't it?
Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. But yeah.
Okay. And actually, Linda, we were going to talk about all the sort of competing interests that are in conservation and the hands out for all the available resources. And of course, the department that is responsible for conservation and environment is also responsible for managing, administering the regulations and the rules for primary industry, which is farming, logging, and industry, which includes mining. So all the conflicts that come up in this area are just evident in the naming of the department and that sort of broad area of government. So I know you may not be able to comment too much on that, but part of the problem, probably want a better word than that, but part of the problem in conservation is this competing for allocation of resources and then everybody stepping on each other's toes. So hopefully we're going to get around some of those issues in the discussion that we'll have now. Tell me, Linda.
Yes.
Tell me, what is Saving Our Species and how did it come about?
So Saving Our Species aims to secure threatened plants and animals in the wild. We've said for 100 years, but what we're trying to say is for the long term. And we're trying to secure as many of them as possible because the alternative is extinction if we're not really managing them. And I think we're just trying to address the problem that Australia has one of the highest rates of threatened species listings and highest rates of extinction in the world. I think part of that is because we're in fact tracking them, so we know what's happening. But nevertheless, it's a problem that we need to address if we genuinely care about plants and animals. And I think at a minimum, the community expects us to prevent extinctions. And they really think that there is a way that we can recover those species. And so it is, but it is a substantial challenge, and that's what Saving Our Species is addressing, because as we are talking, more species get added to the lists. And if we really genuinely want to identify funding, then we need to know how to save those species and how much they're going to cost. Because that has to be part of that broader conversation about resource allocation and how the New South Wales government governs for everybody, not just for people like me. But obviously, if we think this is a priority, by being very clear about what is required and how much it's going to cost is really important. But to get, yes?
Just while we're talking about cost, governments do a regular budget.
Yes.
So how is the funding allocated to your program? In what time frame is each chunk of money given to you and expected to be spent?
So just to give you some background, when we started the program, we weren't exactly clear how much was being allocated to threatened species conservation and where it was being allocated. So we did a major review, and we wanted to look at how we can explain to people exactly what is required to conserve species. So I think in the past, some recovery plans were they could have required infinite amounts of money, and the outcomes weren't clear in those recovery plans. It wasn't clear how much it was going to cost. And our view has been that if you want government to invest in threatened species, we need to be clear that there will be clear outcomes from that investment and how we're going to do it. So that's part of the underpinning logic and methods for how we do our business. And if we're clear, then we're optimistic that government sees it as a priority. Having said that, government reflects the views of the population as well. So we need to know that the public sees conservation as important. But in the first instance, we did this major review. We launched in 2013. We could convince our minister that if we went to government for ongoing investment, that we would deliver particular outcomes and be able to report on it on an annual basis and be clear about what we'd been doing with that money. And so in 2015, Minister Stokes announced a big investment for us, which was 100 million over 5 years. In the past, there'd been quite a lot of investment on the development of recovery plans, but very little on the investment in implementation and clear outcomes. So we put forward a case that if we received that money, that we would secure as many species as possible, recognising that it was experimental, but that we would be able to deliver outcomes. And I think we can say that's exactly what we've done, regardless of how challenging it is. And we're still improving the way that we do that. But in our budget allocation, we aim in that 100 million over 5 years to put the majority of our funding on ground and focused on outcomes. So 80% of the budget is aimed to be on ground, and that includes hiring botanists and experts in conservation. So it includes paying for people that are the experts, but also contracts, partnerships, etc. But it's got a strong focus on ground, and we run pretty lean as a consequence. But if we really do want to secure those species, we have to be able to demonstrate that. And we've improved with that money. There's been a 400% increase in the number of species we're working on. So we're now investing in over 400 plants and animals and threatened ecological communities. And so I think that demonstrates that we've made a big change. And we've made a big change in how we structure our work. That funding finishes at the end of June, and of course, we are working with government to discuss the next stage of investment. But threatened species conservation is part of the legislation, so it will be part of the government's investment in conservation.
Do you expect the next envelope of funding to be for a 5-year period, or maybe, I mean, I know the budget periods also dependent on the electoral cycle in a way, but do you expect the government to give a firm commitment for a period and then to look sort of over the horizon so that everybody who is involved, the academics or the workers that are keeping weeds down or putting fences in or revegetating or whatever on-ground works they're doing, have some certainty to the long-term commitment?
Look, I can't really answer that question on behalf of government, but all I can say is that from the beginning of Saving Our Species, our goal has been to design a program that is about how we do threatened species conservation in the long term. In the first 5 years, we've done quite a lot of experimental work as we transferred a theory into practice and tried to design strategies for each of these species, many of which we weren't really clear on what the actions were, in some cases what the threats were, etc. I think in the next stage of saving our species, obviously I'm optimistic, but I can't speak for government, of course. But threatened species conservation is part of our core business. It's just a matter of scale, really. And, you know, a lot's changed in that 5 years. The Biodiversity Conservation Trust has been put in place, for example, and so there's a number of areas of significant investment in threatened species. The ongoing acquisition of reserves will continue. The securing on private land, there's environmental water, etc. So it's part of a bigger package of how we invest in threatened species.
We'll sort of step through what the selection process and the management and the partnership and whatnot is. But you mentioned water just then, and that's a really sort of fraught area for different reasons. That there's private ownership of it, there's industries totally dependent on it, and then there's the federal system that means water needs to be shared, even though technically it might be owned by one state for a majority of its the length of a river and things like that. So it's a really, really complex and fraught area to competently and successfully manage any kind of natural resource nowadays, isn't it?
Look, all areas are complex, and I can really only speak for saving our species. I mean, there are a group of people who are the experts in environmental water, and they're the experts because of exactly what you've described. There is a benefit for threatened species conservation through the application of environmental water, naturally enough, and that is factored into those decisions that are made. And our frogs certainly benefit from that. But yes, I'm not an expert in environmental water or the water decisions. It is a significant area in its own right.
Yeah, I really just sort of thinking about all the overlay of interests that come up, no matter which part of the puzzle for saving a species that we need to talk about. You mentioned that there's some partnerships going on. Can you talk about the approach of the program? Because it seems, I mean, you've got a really, really good website, I must say, about saving our species. You can really delve into it and get a lot of information about what you're doing,
Yep.
which is far superior to most other government style websites in this area that you see. So tell us about the partnerships, who they're with, which sort of bodies they're with, and why is it preferable than having all of the action sort of in-house by government employees?
Sure. Look, partnerships are a huge part of the program. There's specific partnerships. We don't just partner with everyone to do anything. It's like how we secure threatened species in general. They're really targeted actions. It's clear where we're going to do those actions, why we've chosen those locations, where they are, how we're going to monitor them, etc. So it requires specialist partnerships. And we have, in the last financial year, we had around 220 partners. And that varies from on-ground partnerships. So we've got broadly distributed species, both birds and plants, of course, and they're way beyond the boundaries of national parks. They're on private land, and you can't secure those species without those partnerships. We've got a very constructive relationship with Landcare New South Wales, and Landcare groups in regional locations are doing huge jobs. For example, with the superb parrot is an example of that. And so we have those regional examples crucial to delivering. We also have partnerships with universities where research is the highest priority. Now, of course, we're juggling how we invest our money about whether it should go to research or on ground. And there are some questions that we really need those researchers to answer. For example, we've got a group of species called data deficient, and we can't just do actions because we're not sure what the threats are in some cases, or where to invest our money, or what those actions would be. So those partnerships with universities are really important. We have a partnership with the Environmental Trust, so they're contributing to saving our species. And we have partnerships with some of our NGOs as well. So Bush Heritage, Greening Australia, all of those sorts of groups are now operating as a partner. So we've set up an arrangement that we've identified the key actions, and they come to the table with both their network of volunteers, and that's quite a different network of volunteers to ours as well, come with cash and in kind. So we're multiplying that government investment all the time. And we're just dipping our toes into some of the partnerships with corporate organisations as well. So we'd really like to see the amount of money that's available for conservation to increase substantially. And part of that is by dealing with people external to the organisation. Other sources, of course, are just aligning the current investment that's not so targeted and making it more targeted so that we get better outcomes. But those partnerships are crucial, and we can't do it alone. I don't think government can save all of those species alone. I think everybody has a responsibility to think through the consequences of their actions. And being involved in these areas is a really good way of understanding that. So many people want to be involved. So we're starting with a small number of citizen science projects, not a huge number, because we want to make sure that their investment is effective and that the outcomes are as well. Same with, there's now a really good volunteer portal for our organisation as well. So it's a big range of partners, but we try to make those partnerships meaningful and targeted so that they're doing something really meaningful and targeted on the ground.
Hopefully you can answer this. It's just come to me when you mentioned the citizen science projects. How much has the value of those citizen science projects increased within government? So for decision makers like yourself, are you far more aware of and confident of the information that is gained through citizen science than back in, well, what are we, 7 years earlier from when the program was devised?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want to waste people's time by just humouring them. If they're going to be involved and they're going to commit their time, we want it to be useful. And I suppose there are a couple of examples. There's been some great work with Stream Watch around the Bellinger River snapping turtle, making sure that the quality of the water is okay, because we're still working through those issues and just currently reintroducing some turtles into those water areas, and we want to make sure that they're going to be effective, that we're not setting them up for failure. The other area that's been quite interesting this year has been, or last year and this year, has been Digivol with the Australian Museum. So we've got people that are citizen scientists who are able to log on from their kitchen or wherever their computer is and start to review some of the images of species. And it's made a really big impact because people genuinely want to contribute to conservation. And so this is an effective way to do it. And it's more effective now because we've been working with Digivol so that the data that they're producing is in fact effective and can be used scientifically. I mean, it's not the only way that we're going to be able to identify images from cameras, but at the moment it's really making a huge difference. And one of the projects was about malleefowl, just trying to work out which mounds are being used and when. Another one was post-fire, when we had food being put out for mountain pygmy possums to make sure that it was being used by the possums and that we weren't setting them up for predators as well. So all of those things have been very effective. And people genuinely want to help us. They genuinely want to work with us.
One of the things I really liked about the program while I was having an overview of it is that apart from the standard approach of nominating a species to save and working with official reserves, is that habitats and are sort of prioritized, and that seems to be something that not many of the other states are doing as a priority. They seem to set up, identify an area, make it a reserve, and then try and preserve within the reserve. But you seem to have cast the net a lot wider. Was that by design at the beginning, or has that developed because of the strengthening arrangements or interest with private landholders and the corporate sector?
Look, I think that approach to involving private landholders is, we've got a long history of that in our organisation. Many years ago, I worked with conservation agreements, wildlife refuges. They've been around for a very long time. So I think we've always had that view that conservation is not just on public land or in national park estate. It has to be across the whole landscape. We know that certain areas are not well conserved in the national park estate at the moment, and our goals may be to conserve them, but a comprehensive reserve system is not yet in place, no matter what our goals are. And besides which, we're not the only ones that know how to manage an area. And the plants and animals, as we know, don't care about boundaries. So it's always been a priority for us. Naturally enough, it's a bit harder for us if we're going outside of the reserve system. It's easier to target your efforts with a group of people that you manage directly, but it's not going to be effective if that's our approach. So when we've set up our conservation strategies, and we set one up for each of the species, so it's not just a recovery plan for a few, but it's conservation strategies for all. We run an expert panel and we use the information. We look at the best available data. We look at the listing information, any other information. We get our experts together, and what we're asking them to do is identify what are the priority sites or areas and where would they be if we're going to secure them in New South Wales. And that's a tenure blind process, so it's going to include public and private land. And we need to look at what those critical threats are and how we might manage those threats. So yeah, look, it's always been a high priority for us to look at it across the whole landscape. It's a big state, so we're not doing it all yet, but if we want to conserve all species, then it has to be across the whole landscape of New South Wales.
Well, because we're particularly interested in birds here. Before we talk about a couple of specific species, which areas are there particular regions or particular habitats that you think are most at risk?
Look, I think we've always had an awareness that boxwood lands, for example, are under threat, and they play a significant role as habitat. So obviously with species like Regent Honeyeater, that's a really big issue. But we've just also released, we've got a couple of other recent pieces of work that I could share as well. And one is about the plains wanderer, obviously found in the grasslands of the Riverina and also in Victoria and South Australia. And we've just been working across all of those jurisdictions to release some captive bred plains wanderers. So we don't care which state they get released in. There's breeding programs in Taronga Plains, Western Plains Zoo. There's one in South Australia, one in Victoria. And the Victorians have just released a couple of birds. So that's a major achievement, number one, to be able to breed them captively, but also then to be able to see what happens. And so for us, this makes that sort of area quite significant. And for us in the Riverina, so there are two main areas of work. There is the captive breeding program, but there's also the desire to make sure that we've got habitat that's just right for plains wanderer. And not that I'm a plains wanderer expert, but I do understand from the experts they are a little bird. They wander around on the ground. They're going to be vulnerable. We're lucky we've still got some left, and they're incredibly unique. So we understand it's a really significant area. And
sorry, Linda, can I just stop you there? Luckily,
yep.
we've done an episode on the Plains Wanderer with Dan Nugent. So,
very good.
If you're listening now, just look back a little bit and look for the Plains Wanderer with Dan Nugent, because it is one of the most unique and odd birds with particular challenges. And yeah, that's really good news recently that the first releases have happened. So monitoring, follow up with those releases will be crucial. Linda, do you know how that is being done? Are any being fitted with tags, or is it a matter of camera traps and manual surveys?
Yeah, look, I should know the answer to that, but I'm absolutely unclear whether they've attached something to them or not. I suspect they probably have, but I don't want to say something that's absolutely incorrect.
Well, of course, we can
hopefully
follow up
they know exactly where they are. I don't think they go very far. So at least they'll know.
We can follow up with Dan. Funnily enough, I mean, I'll just make this as a comment, a really different approach to the one you've taken with talking to me is that I couldn't get Zoos Victoria to talk to me about any of the endangered species. It's apparently a secret how they spend public money. But anyway, Linda.
So I've taken a different approach. I want people to know what we're doing and to know how big the problem is as well as what the solution is. So I think we all have that tightrope that we're walking. And I think we've run the risk, if we're not sharing our successes as well, and we've had this conversation about optimism, we run the risk of the public being completely alienated from conservation because of the despair that comes with it. And I don't think we should give up. I think there's things that we can do, and we've managed to demonstrate over the last 5 years that we can, and that we should be prepared to say publicly what we're doing with our money from the government and from taxes. So happy to do that. We will get criticised at various times, but I'd prefer to have a conversation about conservation than have no one interested in it.
And the fact is that some things won't work, but you need to, if you can be as well informed as possible, you can just try and make the the best decisions, because doing something proactive is probably better than doing nothing. In a situation of status quo, like as habitat reduction continues to occur. I mean, if there was no habitat reduction, doing nothing might be a very good thing, you know.
Yeah, look, absolutely. There are some species that we don't actually need to do anything, but we've still got to have a look at them because they're usually rare and something can happen. So it has been a really big change in what we're doing, and I like to think about it as torturing all of the staff by ensuring that they monitor and evaluate on a regular basis. So for each of our species that we're investing in, we've got a monitoring plan developed. And that can be extremely challenging because you've really got to be clear about what your highest priority objectives really are, and whether the actions that you've been doing over a number of years are really helping or not. And so it is a really good way for people to look seriously at how to secure these species. And it can be difficult with some species where there's been virtually no work. But yeah, we've got an annual cycle of people. They need to report on whether they did what they said they'd do. So we develop strategies, and the premise is, from our perspective, you need to do all of those actions, or you're just doing part of the job and it's not going to make the difference that we've said it would make. Have you done what you said you'd do? How much did it cost? Because we've got to get better at being able to cost actions appropriately. It also gives us a strong picture of who else is involved and just how much of that investment is really required to do that. What are the threats looking like? Is there any sort of response in the threats? And then over longer periods of time, how is that species looking itself? Is there any clear indication that there's some sort of more positive trajectory starting to appear for that species? So it's going to be a long-term picture, of course, but it's very significant for us to start to do that. You can imagine people that are good at conservation don't necessarily want to spend all their time in front of a computer doing that, but the fact is we can now publish report cards on our species and say what we've done. And it means that we can look at whether we've been successful or not. And so we've red flagged some of our species. We're not sure that some of the actions are either working or the drought's impacted or something like that, but at least we're reviewing them on an annual basis. And we've put together an SOS technical group, and that includes experts on plants, animals, etc. And if we feel that the strategy that we've developed is not working, we can take it to that group to get some expert advice to us so that we can make up our mind as to whether we need to change that strategy. So it's got quite a lot of overheads, but we've learned a lot, and it's really given us a lot of momentum. I think you'd have to say we've published around 100 scientific papers, so there's a lot of contribution in that way. There's a lot of energy in that way, and I think it's the only way that we can get better at doing the work. Otherwise, we're not putting it to the test.
I think anybody listening can hear that it's a really comprehensive program, which is why I was excited to talk to you about it, because what we seem to see, maybe in a 20-year history, is that the work gets done on producing a recovery plan, and then it's out there on a website, and a lot of people say we've got the recovery plan, but there's no easily available for the public information ongoing. So your scorecards, I think, are great, and I'd really encourage anyone listening to go to environment.newsouthwales or nsw.gov.au and just look for Saving Our Species and check it out. Now, there's been about, I'd say about 3 clear years of work on the ground that following the initial setup and planning. So have you identified any instances of where what you thought would be a good idea, the good things to do on the ground has not turned out to be so, and you've had to reevaluate the approach?
Yes, I suppose there are a number of species that fall into that category. I could suggest, some of the major iconic species are going to fall into that category. So, with malleefowl, we've invested a lot more in LiDAR, being clear about which are active mounds and looking at where we should really be focusing our attention on predator control. I think in general, with those high profile species, we're clear on what the main threats are. So it's not about saying that we got the threats completely wrong, but it's about how much investment or where we're investing is the issue. And I think the other area that we've really had to look at is how effectively we've managed to include the potential impact of climate change as well into those actions. So when we first set up those strategies, I don't think we really addressed that adequately, and we've been working with a range of universities, but we did we set up a tool called Site Centaur tool with Macquarie Uni, and that's looking at where in the landscape we should be thinking about positioning some of those species with that knowledge behind it. So I think that's an area that we hadn't really put enough effort into, and so we're doing that work with the climate change people has made a difference to the strategies we've developed for some of those species. And of course, it will help us to lead into some of the work about whether or not we should dip our toes into some of that experimental work with plants, for example, in thinking about where in the future they should be. So there's lots of potential for us to look at that. I think the way that we prioritise as well, it's not been that straightforward. So site managed species, that is restricted species, has been straightforward. We've really struggled to work out how to identify those broadly distributed species and where we should invest. So that's been an area that has taken us a while. So we've been doing some work looking at the significant locations, mapping those significant locations, and then we have to think about how you overlay it with community interest as well, because you can't just start somewhere where nobody cares. So they're the main areas that we've changed our approaches in, I'd say.
The really limited distribution species tend to become the icon species, for want of a better word. Like, for instance, the Swifties and the Regent's honeyeaters. We know where they. Well, we know roughly where they go, and we know what's got to be preserved.
Yeah.
What are some of those widely distributed bird species that you are concerned about?
Well, look, I think species like the Regent honeyeater is it's clear that that's a real priority for our investment. And as you'd be aware, there's just been around 20 birds reintroduced up in the Upper Hunter to augment the population. It does make conservation quite difficult because they are so broadly distributed. We did do some work with Peggy Eby on a document called about migratory nectar feeding species, and that included Regent honeyeater. It also included flying foxes, which is my other obsession. And they're the same sort of species. So how do we deal with the problem of winter and spring food shortages, and giving some guidance to people that if they are doing some restoration, what sort of species are really going to help those those birds and flying foxes to have something to eat during those really difficult times. So obviously, if those broadly distributed species, it's really about augmenting habitat, as well as some of those other specific actions in locations that are significant, but they're less tangible in a way, but nevertheless really significant. And I think for us, that's going to be a real focus for us going into the future. And it also helps us to look at our prioritisation in bringing together multiple benefits as well. So that, again, will be where we move next. But yeah, certainly species like Regent Honeyeater, they are a challenge.
What are some of the data deficient species that you mentioned?
That's an interesting question. I'd have to have a look at the list, but I can give you some suggestions as to what some of them are. There are quite a few bats on the list, and with some of the bats, particularly those that cave dwelling or the maternity camps are in caves, it's very hard to know where across the landscape exactly those caves are, and having identified them, what do you do about them and where their foraging habitat is as well. So yeah, some of the smaller bat species are certainly in that category. Yeah, apologies, I'd have to have a look at the list.
No, that's okay. I was just wondering if there were any of the birds. I was thinking perhaps more of that sort of that Western New South Wales sort of drier areas where there aren't that many people out there, where perhaps we think that a bird is doing okay, but we don't really know. So have you been surprised by the kind of information that's been coming in over the last sort of 3 to 5 years?
Yes, I was talking to somebody only yesterday about the red Lord whistler, so they're the expert, not me. But when they first started to do the work on the red Lord whistler, they just weren't really sure of what the population size was or exactly where it was. And the majority of the bird's habitat it's on private land. So you've got to be able to work with a whole range of people with varying views of our organisation. And Sarah mentioned just how many cups of tea she'd had during that time, but nevertheless, she did find that she found out a lot more about how broad the distribution was. So I think they're the sorts of issues that we're finding out about, is just where the habitat really is, because I don't think we're really clear in many cases just exactly where the significant locations are. Other times I think we're more optimistic about where they are than they really are, and their habitats really limited. We are doing some work with bristle birds on genetics, for example, just to be clear on how all of those connections work and how that's going to impact any sort of captive breeding if we undertake it. So yeah, all of that information is crucial, but for many of the birds, there's been a whole lot more information accumulated than we had before.
Is captive breeding going to be a real keystone for many of these species going forward, do you think?
Look, I think it is. And when I first came into this area, we perpetually talked about translocation as just being in a very small number of species. I think we'd have to say that we probably look at it in a slightly different way. We have to acknowledge just how expensive it can be and how much damage you can do if you do it without that genetic knowledge, for example. So we have to know a whole lot more. But yes, I think captive breeding certainly will increase. I think we're all getting better at the success of the captive breeding as well. And yes, just getting back to that Plains Wanderer example, when they were first brought into captive breeding, it took a while for them to breed at all, although they did see some unusual behaviour when they're in a cage as to exactly how they go about their everyday life. So they are unusual in every way. But yeah, look, I think captive breeding, augmenting populations, being clear about the genetic robustness is going to be essential. If we really want to see populations get to viable numbers, particularly with birds. I mean, it holds for plants as well. We've been working with the Botanic Gardens on seed collection so that we've got representative seeds, and we've got some of the rainforest species that are impacted by myrtle rust. And of course, birds require us to have their habitats, so unless we do that complementary work with plants, they won't have anywhere to sit and eat, etc. So quite a lot of work on both sides of that are happening. And just trying to work out where things are as well. So as you can imagine, with the bushfires, it's going to be interesting to see what habitat's been impacted. But I feel that because we've had the Saving Our Species program in place, we've had a starting point to go out and see how both the habitat and the numbers are responding.
The genetic work is going to be crucial, I think, to know
Yep.
To know who's who in the zoo, so to speak. Is the cost of that coming down?
Yeah, I think the cost is coming down, and you know, people like University of Sydney, Australian Museum. There are some really incredible partnerships with tech companies as well, with some of the platforms. So I'm optimistic about that area. And for us, I think we just have to be a little bit more organised as well about grouping the species that we need to have a look at. But yeah, absolutely, it's going to continue to be important, particularly if we're doing restoration work. We don't want to stuff it up, and we want to have the right plant species as habitat and for in their own right, so that they survive multiple generations, not just die out in a couple. So yeah, I think the genetic work both on plants and animals will be significant. I think often plants are the poor cousin, and I like to think of the work that we're doing is looking after some of those species that nobody really cares about but are incredibly important. But for animals, genetic work, particularly with these large rewilding programs, will continue to be absolutely significant. Otherwise, we are at risk of getting in the way of the longevity of those reintroduction programs being successful.
In the short history of the program so far, Linda, what do you think is the greatest success that you've had?
The greatest success, I suppose for me, going from a very small number of species to 400 species that we're working on, for me, that's been a huge success. I think one of our other successes has been testing a theoretical model and putting it into practice, and being able to improve on the very basics so that it's workable. I think there are some individual species that we've really made a significant difference with. And, it means that we've been able to continue the investment. I mean, obviously, Saving Our Species has just been around for a short amount of time, and some of this is what this work and these people have been investing in these species for years.
That's
Mountain
right.
pygmy possums, for example, 30 years of data, but by being able to heavily invest, we were able to really control some of the cats and look after some of their habitats. So being able to show a difference has been a really major achievement for us. Being able to start to show trend and trajectories has been major. I think if we're looking at individual species, certainly some of the individual plants have shown some major improvements. The amount of interest in the Glossies in the Mist program has been phenomenal, and that's really benefited from having some extra momentum under the framework of SOS. Same with Save Our Scarlet Robin project. It didn't start with SOS, but we've been able to really augment the amount of money. One of the other successes for me has been being able to trial some new methods. So we've been working with CSIRO on some of the decision-making improvements with machine learning. I think some of the models for working with people have been great. The co-investment model, in which we've worked with big scrub land care and bush heritage. Bush heritage finished up contributing by buying a piece of land, whereas we brought in some extra cash and we brought together a picture of conservation that's about collaboration and longevity. So there's some of the successes. Obviously, some of the individual stories are there on our webpage, and I find them really inspiring to see that. But for me, being able to put in place a system that I think can last for the long term is a real plus. And I suppose going back to that thing of not just investing in the charismatic species. Look, I think glossy black cockatoos are beautiful. I love koalas. I want to see the investment continue in those species. But I do want to see the investment continue in those species that nobody really cares about, some of the small species, or it's only the experts. So, yeah, I call them the scabby little plants that nobody cares about.
Or the little brown bird.
That's right. The little brown birds are doing better than they were. It's the same issues. So, and I think there'll continue to be a role for us in, even if we get better at those partnerships and investment from the public, there'll still be a group of species that we'll need to make sure are okay.
Well, I don't know what your background has been, Linda, but I think you must be a very good strategic thinker and really good at looking forward. One of the things I think is great about the program is that it sort of locks in a lot of that corporate memory, for want of a better thing, with each of the species, because
it does, yeah.
As people, I'm not sure that the general community understand that one of the main problems the academics have is that they'll get a short-term project to do a survey or to conduct some research on, which breeding hollow size is better or whatever like that. But it's very short term, and it's very, 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 very tiny amounts of money for them to actually live on. So with this continuity, with a vision for 100 years, it means people will be able to continue to be involved without being reliant on the species they love for an income. There's lots of species, you got 400 in this program alone. And if the other states and territories sort of model on your sort of architecture, people who have been involved in a particular species for 20 or 30 years of their life won't have to starve to be involved, which is what I think is a really big asset, because every time the expert in a field or in a species has to take up an opportunity in Africa or Asia or Australia, we've lost that on the ground knowledge. It's only in the published papers that we can check out what is known. So I think,
look, I agree with you, and it is important to get that data into systems. As I said, it does torture people, and it's all in different formats, and we've got to do it. But I think everybody can see what happens when you can, in fact, tell that story and help people to understand what threatened species is about. So it's a very powerful thing. And the other thing is that I feel like we're going through a generational change as well. If you've, threatened species legislation has been there for a while, and one of the pluses for us is that we've been able to get some new staff into the organisation and support some PhD work as well. And it's the next generation of people that are going to be committed to conservation. And we can't, as you said, we can't lose that information either when it's short-term funding. So we need to get that data and be clear where that data can go to. So getting a database together and et cetera is important, methods, etc. But it's also getting the information off people's desktops and the like into an overall system. And it's also being able to say that conservation is a long-term effort, and we need to be ready for the next generation of people to come through and have that expertise and bring their new ideas as well. So yeah, look, we have been really privileged to be able to work on this and to work with so many experts. I'm not, I think my biggest quality is just dogged determination, really. However, yeah, I think everybody that's been working in the program sees it as frustrating at times, but what a great experience to be able to make a difference like this. And everybody would like to see threatened species be a topic that lots of people want to talk about and want to think about and be involved with.
Are the other states and territories consulting with you? I mean, are they looking, do you think, to take on some of the aspects of your program?
Look, I think everybody has acknowledged that you can't just write plans and then not implement them. You need to have good plans, but you have to implement them. And we've certainly met with other jurisdictions. One of the pluses for us is the investment, the commitment from the New South Wales government. They made that commitment of 100 million that has really made it possible to get the momentum behind the program. So I would hope that whatever other jurisdictions are tackling they've got the same problem of increasing numbers of extinctions and how you prioritise your investment. I would hope that they can use any of the information that we've got, because we like to share, and that includes starting to look at benefit cost ratios, etc. when you're starting to look at these sort of threatened species efforts. None of that's particularly straightforward either, but we're happy to share to make a very strong case that if you invest in a targeted way, you do get outcomes. So I'm absolutely sure that other jurisdictions are working towards that. Having said that, other jurisdictions are achieving huge amounts as well. We just pull it all together. Same with the investment from the Australian government. So bring it together as a whole. It's just that commitment to collaborating and improving all the time. And change is difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, systems are very, very hard to change when they're entrenched in a massive bureaucracy. It doesn't mean they're all bad. It's just very hard to tinker with them. That takes planning and time, doesn't it?
It does.
Now, we talked about the citizen science projects earlier.
Mm.
For the remainder of 2021, what are the events or activities that a citizen scientist who's been hearing you speak can look forward to being involved in?
Yeah, look, there's, as I said, there's quite a lot of work happening with Digivolve. So if you are interested in if you're interested in getting onto the Australian Museum site, then yes, you can do some work. Some of the other projects, There's a community wildlife survey that's just about closing, but yeah, that's available. I think it's really important. It's asking if people have seen some quite everyday species. They're the indicators, so koalas, quolls, etc. Bellinger River Watch, they're still doing some work as well. So there's certainly a couple that I could recommend people do. There is a citizen science hub on our webpage, and we've just run a little competition to try and match people up. That could be looking at slugs or taking photos of particular birds, etc. So there's a whole range of them on our webpage, but there's a small selection.
Is that in the topics section?
It is. It's called the Seed Citizen Science Hub, and it's available. If you do Citizen Science Hub, it'll take you there. If you do a Google search on Citizen Science Hub.
Okay, yeah. I was just looking at the Saving Our Species sort of portal, and so yeah, I think the entry to that there would be through threatened species or surveys, monitoring, and records.
Yeah, and look, another one, of course, is Frog ID. I mean, Jody Rowley
does
Jody Rowley is magnificent. So anybody that's got a phone and has Frog ID on their phone, and certainly if it's just rained, Jody will be happy if you identify some. So yeah, there's a whole selection of some that are coming up.
Isn't it extraordinary the work that Jody has done, and that pretty much any calling frog now anywhere in Australia can be ID'd on a phone.
I know, she's amazing.
It's astounding. It's
And
astounding.
it's also her as well, that her absolute enthusiasm and passion. And it is a dilemma for all of us because the number of species at risk is really huge, and sometimes we think we've got to do everything, but focusing your attention on a group of species in such a targeted and effective way, I know they're just identifying them, but that absolute obsession, passion, it's like birdos, I would have thought. Once you're obsessed by these species, it's not just identifying them, it then leads on to the next steps as well, and the awareness that comes with it, the knowledge, the desire to make a difference, etc. So yeah, you need people that are absolutely fascinated by their species and can communicate about it and want to communicate with people.
Absolutely. Well, we need to sort of draw the strings together a bit. So we've talked about how a citizen scientist can be involved. How can someone with professional skills, academic skills, or practical conservation on the ground skills get involved with the program?
Look, I think there's a number of ways that people can be involved. I think everyday people can just be involved by supporting the importance of investment in threatened species. There are ways, citizen science volunteers, absolutely crucial. I think there are ways that you can donate through organisations to contribute to particular species. One of our strong partners is Landcare. Join a Landcare group. It's really important. Wildlife carers. Again, both of those areas, I think, need to navigate a generational change. They need young people coming in, taking up the banner. In terms of research, yeah, look, we're happy to work with people on what specific questions we have coming up. And it's time now, as we look into the future, to get a research catalogue together. So that will involve working with researchers and our own staff to work out what the key areas are. Lots of ways. We've got a part of our webpage is how you can join the movement. So I think there are a range of ways that people can get involved.
Terrific. Join the movement, exactly.
Join the movement.
And look, I don't usually put a call out for the stuff I'm doing, but if you're a researcher doing something interesting with threatened birds, certainly reach out. It's I know not
Yeah.
all of you are checking your Twitter DMs. I know that for sure. Um, Linda, you mentioned you're not really a bird nerd and that you're pretty into bats, but I have a sort of a standard run of questions that we have for all the guests. So let's modify them slightly. Have you got a favourite little critter?
Uh, well, as I said, I am in terms of birds.
And
Oh,
anything. I
look,
mean, if
I
you've
I
got a
do
favourite
like flying
bird,
foxes. I am a plant person, so I love box woodland, and grey box trees are one of my absolute favourites. I do love cockatoos. I know they're big and it goes against everything that I was saying, but I do wear glasses and I can at least see them. And I love the tenacity of them being able to adapt to urban as rural environments. And I love their intelligence. They're so smart. I do love flying foxes as well because, again, they're incredibly intelligent. And I do like an underdog as well. I've got that Australian culture. Poor old flying foxes, they do get a hard time, but I think they're fantastic.
well, I'm glad that you said you're a bit of a plant head. Are you a Myrtaceae or Proteaceae?
Myrtaceae.
I think that's how Australian plant people sort of split. I reckon that's the top of the key, or maybe it's angiosperms, or I don't know. But yeah, I think
Yeah,
everyone's got. It's
it
either
depends.
gums
Yeah.
or Banksias, or
Mm.
or the wattles might get a look in. But yeah, look,
Yeah. And I
but
think the longer that you work in the areas, the better your eye is, and the more obscure, Cyperaceae and all the little orchids become so significant because you notice them. So anyway.
So have you got all the volumes of Flora of New South Wales in your bookshelf at home?
Look, not anymore. I've got a whole lot of stuff online. I've become a modern person. And
Well,
yeah,
it's pretty hard to lug Flora of New South Wales around.
that's right. And aren't we lucky that we have access to so much information? And
Oh,
it just is one of our next projects as well, improving and updating all of our threatened species profiles so that people can see the most current information. It's image led and inspires those people that have grown up online to really be involved and motivated by conservation. So that's a next step for us as well.
when you're out in the great outdoors, Linda, what's your favourite piece of gear? What's your favourite piece of kit?
Uh, it'd have to be, look, I'm a simple person, so it'd have to just be having a pair of binoculars.
Wide angle or narrow field?
Look, as I said, I'm a simple person. I'm not an expert. I just like to have the simplicity of it.
Okay.
You need to talk to a bird expert.
Oh, I think we can all relate to binoculars. Have you got an old pair? Like, have you still got the pair you got when you're teenager or whatnot, handed down from granddad or something?
I have got a pair that my father had, yeah, so they're kind of heavy, but yeah, they're good. As I said, I spend most of my time being a bureaucrat and waving my arms trying to make the program hang together. So when I go out in the bush, I love to just hear what people are doing, whether it's them describing what's happening with nest boxes. We just went up north and looked at some on the north coast with wild B&B and some of the nest boxes. And yeah, I need people to point out the birds to me. But yeah, I'm a basic person, but love the fact that they're there, whether I see them or not.
And where's your favourite place to go out in the wilds?
Uh, yeah, as I said, look, I have a number of favourite places. We go up. I like to be able to go within a short travelling distance. So I really like some of those areas around Capety. I think they're beautiful areas as
And
well.
is there somewhere that you would really, really love to go? Have you got a bucket list location?
Look, I think my husband and I would probably go into some sort of rainforest area that's inland. I love the coast as well, but I think that'd be the area that we could really enjoy a life near close to nature and enjoy that. So pretty flexible about where that is, but yeah, I think slightly higher, lush. Time to look at those sorts of areas.
And check off all those syzygiums.
Yeah, they are amazing. Let's hope they hang in there.
They certainly are. They certainly are. And just on that sort of thing about locations
Mm,
in New South Wales,
mm.
where do you think the next real pressure points are going to come about with the ever expanding human population and the critical habitats? Are you doing any sort of preemptive planning there? Can you see that there's an area that's going to get under great stress?
Look, when you're dealing with the whole of New South Wales, just like people that deal with the whole of Australia, you can see pressure points all over the place. But yeah, I'd like to tackle some examples of climate change impacts. And one of those areas, I think, is the Gondwana rainforest areas. And that goes for both plants, birds, frogs. And wouldn't it be great if we started to look at some of that experimental work?
Yeah, well, Linda, maybe a bit down the track we can talk about how the state is reacting to climate change, and how just whether we've seen any positive movement or anything really innovative. Maybe a year down the track or so. I think we all know it's really important, but it seems to be an area that is really difficult to move in. But yeah, look, thanks so much, Linda. I think I'm sure anybody listening will be heading off to have a look at saving our species as part of the New South Wales government website. And yeah, I reckon they'll be impressed the same way I was when I sort of stumbled across it. I wish you all the success in the world with it, because it's a massive job you've got administering it. So
Thank you for saying such nice things. It's really appreciated. I really do appreciate getting that sort of feedback. And with everything, it's a team effort. There's a huge number of committed people across New South Wales that make it all possible. So, but thank you for your positive feedback. We all need to know that it's we're doing the right thing, and really, thank you.
well, just the thing that really struck me, Linda, is that there's a common thread, I think, when you look at a lot of websites, whether they be departments or national parks or just governments in general, when they are looking at threatened species or preservation of a location, they tend to try and limit it down so it's easy to manage and easy to talk about, and that the outcomes are sort of just about we've protected this area. But it seems to me that you've taken the reverse approach and opened it right up, and that seems to be key. You've got to save everything. You can't just save one honey eater. You've got to save the plants. You got to save the insects. You got to save the fungi. You got to save the leaf litter that they all depend on. It and I really appreciate the holistic approach you're taking. Whether or not it's just all too much, I don't know. But if the government, the government have to keep backing up such a big. Well, it's just big in general. So the funds have to be big. So, yeah, great. Keep pushing, Linda.
Look, I'm grateful for the support that we've had. If we didn't have the ministers that backed us in the first place, we wouldn't be where we are. So, yeah, there are people in the government that do have that vision. Our current minister has a very strong vision for the environment. So I feel very fortunate with that. And yeah, look, important things do cost a bit of money, and environment should be factored into those sorts of budgets, and it is. So we've been fortunate to be able to spend it well, I hope.
Well, next time you're sending a handwritten note off to the minister, just let him know you were on the show and that we'd love to talk to him. And
Okay.
I'll because I really would. I think he takes a different approach than many of the ministers. Yeah, he seems to have his head around it. So yeah, I'd love to talk to him. Been a delight talking to you, Linda. I hope you can get out there and see all the syzygiums before they're gone.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a Murtacey joke for any of you who aren't a plant person out there. So
there must be Linda, some bird people that know plants as well.
Well, they're probably still calling them eugenias, though. Displaying my bias there, Linda, too. Thanks again. Please, everybody, head off to the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment website and have a fossick through the Saving Our Species program. And if you're involved in conservation in one of the other states, perhaps tap your IT people on the shoulder and say, hey, have a look at this. Wouldn't it be great if we had a portal like this? And so, Linda, thanks for being on the Bird Emergency.
Thank you very much for your time and the questions. It's been really good to be able to talk with you. I've really enjoyed it.
I'll talk conservation with you anytime you want.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye.